Welcome back to AM Agenda. Joining me today on my panel is Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer and Shadow Assistant Communications Minister Michelle Rowland. First to you, Michelle, just on Qantas, why should the government be providing a debt guarantee?
I think that's one of the options that should be on the table, and as we heard earlier, this is something that's being discussed at Cabinet. I mean, it's disturbing for a start that it's taking this long to even think about formulating a plan, let alone a coherent one. We're getting different messages from Mr Hockey and from Mr Abbott, but I think at the end of this we need to remember this is about thousands of jobs. It's about the flow-on effects that come from those jobs as well, and I think we need to make a decision, well at least this government needs to make a decision about, do we want a national carrier and what form will that take? And a national carrier that keeps jobs in Australia is certainly one that Labor supports.
Kelly O'Dwyer, there does seem to have been a bit of divergence on messaging here. A week ago we were hearing from Joe Hockey that it seemed like he was ready to throw Qantas a lifeline with the debt guarantee, and on the weekend Tony Abbott's all but ruled it out. Has there been I guess, a bit of a journey to this decision? Or
I don't think there's been a divergence of message. And if I can just pick up on something that Michelle said, I'm very pleased to hear that the Labor Party supports us keeping jobs in Australia and that they support jobs. If they're, though, very real about that, what they will do is allow us to get on with abolishing the carbon tax, which has put a huge impost on Qantas, $106 million as a tax. We know it's going to be $160 million or more, which is cumulatively around about the figure that they announced as their loss just recently.
But so you'd admit that the carbon tax isn't the biggest problem here for Qantas.
Well, it's a significant problem in making them less competitive. That's been acknowledged by Qantas. It's also particularly been acknowledged by Virgin boss as well, John Borghetti, because he's come out and said that it's having a significant impact on making them less competitive. So if they're serious about jobs, what they'll do is not waste any more time. They'll accept the mandate that we were given at the election, and they will help us get rid of the carbon tax, which was what we were elected to do.
Michelle, it is true that John Borghetti did cite on Friday when he released the half-year profits for Virgin that the carbon tax was an issue, and he urged the Labor opposition to not stand in the way of repeal. Is Labor going to heed that message?
Well, I think John Borghetti can, he's free to say whatever he likes in the context of his role and explaining the financials of his company. But, Kelly talks about moving aside and, letting them carry out their mandate. I could go into a lot about carrying out a mandate, which is what Labor had to do in its first term in office. But also, I just hear time and time again, you turn on the TV and you see Liberal MPs, firstly they've got the talking points from a year ago, get rid of the carbon tax, and then they start blaming the workers. I was on one of these shows the other day, I was up against one of Kelly's colleagues, he starts blaming the workers. Workers should get out of the unions, get out of the way, workers get out of the way, workers get out of the way. Well, listen. Because I think at the end of it, we need to make sure that we remember one thing, and that is this government is in government now. You can't just go around blaming. You cannot just go around blaming everything. You cannot just go around blaming everything on the price of carbon, because the reality is this government has no plan. You're in opposition with no plan, and then they got elected and there's no plan.
Let's get to one of the other options that is on the table. That is changing the Sale Act. Chris Bowen this morning made it very clear that there is a red line here for Labor, and that is the 49%. But what are you willing to tinker with within that margin?
Well, I think Chris also said we're very ready to see what proposals the government wants to come up with within those ambits of the Sale Act. And the other thing you need to bear in mind, and Anthony Albanese went through this in quite good detail a few days ago, there's a reason why there's limits on how much foreign ownership there can be in an airline, and it's because of the international agreements we have on aviation between countries. It's the reason why you can't get, for example, some airlines fly directly from Australia to the US. So we need to bear that in mind as well. But we're very ready to look at what proposals the government comes up with. It would be nice if they had one instead of a couple.
And Kelly, what is the government going to come up with today, and would you urge Cabinet to do this quite quickly? We have known about Qantas's problems for some time. There has been a bit of flying as kites, as Labor might describe it, over the last couple of weeks. So when can we see an answer?
Well, clearly this matter is going to be discussed in Cabinet today, and what we've said all along is that we're going to look at all of the options. We've also
Except
said
for
we're
a
going to
government
examine
debt guarantee.
Well,
Is
we're-
that off the table?
We've said particularly that we are very focused on the Qantas Sale Act, which is imposing conditions on Qantas that are not imposed on any other airline. That's not to say that we don't support a national carrier. We do. We do support a national carrier in this country. It's important for our country to have a national carrier. But what we're saying is it's not real world anymore to impose the same conditions that were imposed decades ago.
So are you saying
on
just
Qantas.
by proposing changes to the Sale Act, that is only a medium to long-term solution? The government can't offer anything short-term?
One of the biggest issues for Qantas is actually access to capital. That is their biggest issue, and that's what they have been saying now for some time. One of the biggest ways that they can get access to capital, and one of the best ways, is to be able to have investors invest in Qantas. And the people who are most likely to want to invest in Qantas are foreign investors. Foreign investment is not a dirty word. Foreign investment is actually very good. It will help us grow our economy, not only with our airline, but potentially with all sorts of other areas as well. We've seen the impact on agricultural development, on business development. So, I think it's quite bizarre that the Labor Party are going to stand in the way of this.
I'll quickly let you to respond to that, Michelle, but I want to move on to pensions as well. There is reports out today that perhaps pensioners that own their own expensive homes could be cut off from welfare or could receive less welfare. Is that a move that you would support?
Well, I think firstly, sure, the Liberal Party, the government supports foreign investment, except when it's to do with GrainCorp, an investment coming from the US. So I don't know what they stand for in that area, but I'll put that to one side. Look, I don't think that in terms of having the family home included in some sort of assets test, that's not something that the government supports. I think it's very important to remember two things. However, firstly, Australia is ageing. We're getting older. We're living longer, and it's important to make sure that we have people supported in our communities. And pensions is one way, but also as I go around my communities, one of the biggest concerns is not only residential aged care, but also in-home aged care. So they are huge issues. But also, the second point is, this was Tony Abbott straight before the election saying pensions wouldn't be touched. And time and again in Parliament last week,
but Labor did
failed to
increase
have
the
a
pension
guarantee.
age. Labor already had moves in place to increase the pension age to 67. There's now talk that could go to 70. Would Labor continue to support that incremental increase?
Well, we would look at whatever government proposals were put on the table, but I will make this point, that the biggest single increase in the pension in its history came under Labor. The aged care pension came under Labor, and I've heard the news this morning about. I heard the news this morning about the government is putting an increase on the pensions this week. That's actually an inbuilt indexation measure. That's going to happen anyway. The sun comes up, the pensions go up on indexation day. So to hear these people try and take credit for that is absolutely laughable.
Kelly, your response, and is this something that's actively being considered, and it is supported by the Business Council, and Paul Howes as well has flagged his support for it, so you have some support in some unusual quarters, perhaps.
Well, look, Labor is going to mount a desperate fear campaign on anything that they can in order to distract from the fact that they're blocking the carbon tax repeal in the Senate. I mean, they're very keen to distract everybody with this nonsense. It's fair to say that we are increasing the pension on the 20th of March. It's going up by CPI. That's an increase in the pension, not a decrease.
Wasn't that indexed under Labor?
Well, no. The index does happen. It's built in, and that is something that we support. That is actually something that is also part of our government policy as well. So it's going up for aged pensioners on the 20th of March. That's something that the government supports. That's something that we've spoken about. And in terms of assets and in terms of homes, they're going to mount a fear campaign on all sorts of things. It's very typical for the opposition to do that in the lead up to the budget, and I think we have to take it all with a grain of salt.
And just finally, when on Qantas, do you expect that we will see an announcement sometime this week? Because there needs to be a legislative change here.
Well, look, it depends very much on what the opposition is prepared to do. Unfortunately, they've been terribly obstructionist. We've seen that with the carbon tax, and I suspect we're going to see it with Qantas as well. So they can't say that Rome is burning when they're not prepared to put out the fire.
Michelle, just finally your thoughts?
Can I go back to the age pension just for 1 second, though?
We've only got 30 seconds.
Well, I think it's very important to recognise that there is a lot of concern in the community about raising the retirement age. There is a lot of proposals that have been done. And as I travel around my communities, this is a high cause of concern. I don't think any commentators or any politicians from any sides should be under any illusions otherwise.
Michelle Rowland, Kelly O'Dwyer, thanks for joining us on AM Agenda. And we'll be back with more of the program after the break.